Oh, sure, they got spit on. Uh, Things got thrown at them. Their cars got keyed. Uh, yeah, it was tough for people to cross the picket line, but a lot of them did inside of a couple weeks. They needed the money, and they looked around and said, "If I don't have this job, where will I find another job?" Uh, so yeah, the threat of violence was somewhat real. Things got burned. There was assaults on various distribution centers. A truck at the North Plant got burned, and I quoted in the chapter I wrote for a book on union violence in newspaper strikes. I quoted the religion writer from the Detroit News because someone asked her how she thought the truck got set on fire that was inside the fence at the North Plant, and Kate DeSmet said, "I think it was an act of God." There were a lot of people that were sympathetic to the unions, individual people. I have never in my history in the newspaper business seen so many yard signs, "No free press here" or "No news here," all over the Grosse Pointes. And the Grosse Pointes are basically historically a conservative Republican community. I don't think most of those yard signs were on conservative Republican yards, but there was a lot of sympathy. As I said, public officials, I think the president of the Detroit City Council got arrested for demonstrating in front of the Detroit News building. I think the mayor was basically sided with the unions. One of the terrible mistakes the unions made was that they said they wouldn't talk to either the News or the Free Press, which was a golden opportunity in terms of public relations for the companies. So the companies always could say what they wanted to say, but when somebody from Channel 7 would call the union and say, "We're going to share this story with the Detroit News," they'd say, "Well, then we won't talk to you." So. Oh, I think, sure, the strike could have been avoided. I think that Gannett wanted to go to the mats. They wanted the unions to strike, and the unions fell for it. I mean, they walked out at the worst time of year. Why would you walk out in early July when that's the time when the newspaper business is at its lowest? I mean, most people are on vacation, people aren't reading the newspaper. If you're going to walk out right before the advertising starts to roll in for back to school, or right before Christmas, when up to 20% of the total newspaper advertising for the year runs in the Christmas rush. I mean, do it with some sort of science. But they didn't. They went out in July. And I think that's what Frank Vega wanted. I think that's what he was told to accomplish. And I think he was happy as a clam. And I think if you asked him that question, he'd probably tell you he was. He had a Darth Vader mask in his office. So he said they called him Darth Vega. I was very proud of that. It showed it to me when I worked on that chapter on newspaper violence. I would say several years, except in some senses it has never completely returned to normalcy. It is gradually returning as the staff's turnover and you get younger people in that were never associated with it. You have people working at the News and Free Press, probably 60 to 80% of their union members now didn't know what the union was like before. So the fact that the union is toothless now is not a shock or surprise to them. So I would say that time is eroding the animus, but there are still people out there who will not talk to other people that were involved on one side or the other of the strike. I mean, people who were best friends. It's a lot of animus. Well, I don't think the newspapers were as good afterwards. I don't think they ever recovered. And then, of course, they all hit the revolution in the business, and then now it's completely impossible to tell what they're like. I mean, the Free Press looks like New York Daily News turned to broadsheet. I mean, big story on hoarders on the front page with blazing headlines, and you say, was this the most important story in the world on any given day for a major metropolitan newspaper? People that stuff their houses with junk. There's no question in my mind, and Heath Merriweather, who I also had hired at one time at the Miami Herald, and who was publisher, he called me up and complained because I said the papers weren't as good. And I said, Heath, you know they're not as good. And he says, well, none of the papers are as good. And I said, it's misery loves company theory. If we're all worse, we should get away with it. That was before the economic crash. Yeah, I think it had a major impact. I think it scared unions all the way across the country that were getting ready to negotiate contracts in newsrooms. I think the Washington Post sent people in to talk to Frank Vega about how they handled the strike. I think other major news organizations that were facing contract negotiations came to Detroit to check it as a model. And I think there were very few newspaper strikes of any note after the one in Detroit.